I'm Matt Booker.
I'm Dave Laird.
And this is Christian TeBordo. So join me in the Great Concavity for a long interview with a hideous man.
Is that you, me, Matt, or Wallace, Christian?
We'll let him pick.
Yeah, like all good fiction, it's up to the reader to do with it what they will, interpretation-wise, I guess. Awesome. Well, welcome to the show, Christian. This is episode 55 of The Great Concavity, and we're very excited to have you with us. You've kind of come to us through like a long line of recommendations from Kyle Beachy, who was a guest 10 or 12 episodes ago now. So Kyle just keeps bringing the hits for us.
Nice. Kyle's a colleague. He's a great dude.
Yeah. So he put us on to your book, Toughlahoma, which is your second most recent book. Mm-hmm. And Rescue Press sent us copies of that. So Matt and I both had a chance to read that last year. And then you are also the author of a more recent short story collection called Ghost Engine, which we talked about with Adam Levin a couple episodes ago. And he sung its praises. And his wife, Camille Bordas, has sung its praises right even on the cover with an endorsement. So we thought, all right, let's get copies of Ghost Engine, let's read it, and then let's get Christian on the show finally. So here we are. Thanks for coming by.
Nice. Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome, man.
And normally you're in Chicago, right? You teach. Where do you teach now? I should ask, or where did you teach in the past?
I teach in the MFA program at Roosevelt University in Chicago.
Same with Kyle.
That's where Kyle is too, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Hence your familiarity and friendship. Or did you guys know each other before working together?
Well, actually, we vaguely knew each other before, and it's very strange, actually, because I emailed him out of the blue a few years before I got the job based on a review that he'd written of The Pale King.
Oh, yeah.
And we had a long email chain about empathy, and he recognized my name when I applied for the job because we wrote a lot of words, but we didn't agree on anything.
He did say that you have an interesting take on Wallace. And I mentioned that to Adam when we talked to him, or in the emails with Adam Levin, and he said, yeah, that's true. Ask him about it. So, but I don't know what your take is quite yet. I've seen you've mentioned him a couple times in interviews, but here we are to obviously explore that a little bit more. And of course, talk about your own writing too.
Sure. And I mentioned that I asked where you teach in Chicago, because at the beginning of the call before we started recording here, you mentioned you were quarantining in New York. So we always want to, I kind of want to ask, like, what has that been like? What's your kind of COVID-19 story been so far?
I have it's like a tale of two pandemics for me, because as the director of the program, I had a lot of stuff to do when we first went online, just making sure that we could all, arrange things. And, but then, so I finished out my semester in Chicago, but we live in a 700 square foot 2-bedroom apartment. And I have a 9-year-old, who's still going, or as of last week was still going to school online. So when my semester ended, we came over here, and I was telling Dave the restrictions in New York are actually more strict than they are in Illinois, but the fact that we lived in such a tiny little apartment kind of got in the way of things, and so we have a little more room to spread out in my dad's house, and there's a backyard and stuff. So.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's nice. Still going to school. That's pretty brutal, man. It's like late June when we're recording this. It's like almost July, but that's a long time. I mean, my kids have been out since like a month from online school.
Oh, wow.
And now the question is what's it going to be like when they go back, in mid-August? And a lot of parents are already like, we're just going to homeschool. So I think it's seriously upending the kids' lives,
Yeah, I mean, things got real dreadful and philosophical, and particularly when we were crammed into the little apartment in Chicago, we spent a lot of time talking about the meaning of life and stuff like that. It's a lot to put on a little 9-year-old.
Yeah, I'll bet. And I mean, recent events in the last month specifically have really escalated that conversation too in so many different ways.
Absolutely, yeah.
During all this quarantine stuff too, so it's been a a pretty remarkable, like dizzying time in human history here.
Sure has.
Yeah.
Yep.
And one thing that's been on my mind today is like just the different realities, like of Dave and I. Like, I'm in Texas where shit is terrible COVID wise and police wise as well, but Dave's in New Zealand where they've basically defeated COVID like a month ago. And Dave's like, yeah, I went to the bar. And I'm like, they just closed all the bars again the other day. So it's pretty stark contrast, I feel like. Yeah.
I feel like quite bad talking to anybody from North America right now about like what my life is like here in New Zealand. Like, I don't want to like be a jerk by saying that, yeah, like I went out for drinks with somebody the other night and talked about Wallace for 3 hours, you know, like, yeah.
So now that we've got that out of the way, Christian, some of my questions for you, now that we've just checked that off, because I am curious, you know, and like our last episode, we talked to Martina, who was in Italy, and like, I was just really curious, like, what's that been like for you? And like, everyone's kind of got a different story about it. And there's a lot, you know, I feel like it would be remiss not to acknowledge the context in which we're having this conversation.
Absolutely.
But what I was going to say is like, you know, asking about where you are is like, I want to kind of start with like, how did you get here? Where did you grow up? Like, what's your background? And, you know, eventually, let's start with that, because I have other questions that stem from that. But like, you know, where did you grow up? What made you want to be a writer? Sort of, what's your background?
Okay. I grew up about a mile from where I am right now, actually, in the town of Cohoes, New York. I've thought a lot about when I realized that I wanted to be a writer, but I don't think that there's a very, very solid answer. Both of my parents were Presbyterian ministers, and so they wrote sermons every week. And so I know about the practice of writing and the practice of sticking to deadlines. And so I also, you know, was kind of pushed to memorize large swaths of the Bible and stuff like that. So my relation to text has been since I was, you know, basically an infant. But I never really started seriously writing until high school. I didn't even like reading books, honestly. And stumbled on Vonnegut in high school, and then Barry Hannah shortly after that, and knew that was what I wanted to do. I went to Bard College to study whatever. They don't really have majors there, but you would have probably called me a literature major. But I was really, really lucky to study with just awesome writers and editors while I was there. And,
can you name a couple of the writers? Who was the writers that were there when you were there?
Well, my first workshop professor was John Ashbery, the poet.
Holy shit.
Oh, wow.
And and I was doing a lot of poetry. And Ashbery was just such a pleasure to be around and so much fun to listen to. But what happened was I would listen to him and I would realize that I still didn't know how to get better at as a poet. So I actually started writing prose because I could actually tell when I was doing something wrong. You know, I would hand in a poem to Ashbery, and one week he would say, "This is great." And the next he would say, "I don't think it's quite there." And he would talk about it, but I couldn't understand the difference between the two. Whereas with fiction, it's fairly easy for me to see the difference. I also studied with Bradford Morrow, who is the editor of Conjunctions, on top of being a writer himself. And he introduced me to basically, you know, a lot of the writers that I still think of as my favorite writers today.
He's a big Wallace fan. I mean, he published Wallace in Conjunction several times. And, they had quite a correspondence.
Yeah, he was actually where I first learned of Wallace. I was in Bard from 95 to 99. And I remember when Infinite Jest came out, hearing of the hype around that book and just asking Brad if he knew about the guy. And he was like, actually, I'm pretty close with him. I think my follow-up question was, does he really wear the bandana? And so it was. He was. You know, he brought all kinds of, you know, some of my favorite writers to campus, and it was a Bard was just a wonderful experience. So
that's, you know, I think we were the exact same age, because that's the same years I was in undergrad, and I also have a 9-year-old as well.
Wow.
which is crazy. He turns 10 in September. But one connection I think about with Bard College is I went to University of Denver for undergrad, and like you look at your professors like pedigree, you know, you're like, who did they study with and where did they get their degrees, right? And I remember I studied with the writer Ricky Ducournay, and she was at Denver at the time. And Ricky, like, she was a tenured professor at DU, and her highest degree was a BA from Bard College. And it was just hilarious. Like all these other, you know, like Denver is one of the few schools that offers PhD in creative writing. And it was like every single other professor, like in the whole school, had a PhD except Ricky. It's like Ricky, just a BA, and she's a tenured professor. And I always thought like, wow, that's really cool. Like maybe you could just go to Bard College and get a BA and get tenure.
She was the rumor was always that she was the subject of the Steely Dan song too. Ricky, don't lose that number.
You know what? I had heard that, and I actually don't know how true that is.
Yeah, I don't either.
I don't know how true that is.
Legend.
There's a lot of stories about Ricky actually. So after that, you did get an MFA. I assume you wanted to. At that point, you're like, okay, I'm going to keep doing this, right?
Yeah, I actually took some time off. I graduated kind of young, and I wanted to explore the world, and I fell in love with a woman who I am now married to have been for 17 years, and she's from down south, so we spent a year in North Carolina.
Oh yeah.
And turned out that we didn't like living in North Carolina as much as we thought we did. So about midway through, I decided I was going to apply to grad school, and I got into Syracuse.
Oh really?
And,
wow.
Yeah.
Cool.
And spent 3 years there, which is where I met, half the people I'm still friends with. So.
Did you work with George Saunders there closely as well?
Yeah.
Like Adam did?
Yep.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't work as closely with George as Adam did because my thesis advisor was Gary Lutz.
Okay, yeah.
But we had a lot of great faculty there.
Oh, cool. I was just thinking, like, reading through Ghost Engine that, like, I think you and George are pretty kindred spirits in the kinds of themes that you're writing about, like a lot of kind of like utopia or dystopian, capitalist, consumer culture gone crazy stuff seems to like factor into some of your stories in this collection. And that you two probably would have a pretty fun time having a beer together.
Yeah, George is just the loveliest person that I know. He's, I lucked out in having a great father, but like he's like a father figure to a lot of people, like a lot of students. You know what I mean? 'Cause he's wise and funny and understanding, and you just feel like a better person when you're around him.
Yeah.
Oddly, as a student writer, I actually butted heads with him a lot, and it was my fault. I was a young punk, and I wanted to write mean stuff. And George is this very open-hearted, tender person, and I think you notice this. Like his stories end differently than mine. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like we both focus on the ugliness and things, and then he finds some moment of redemption usually at the end. Whereas I say no, it just stays ugly.
So your like Presbyterian background, either went pretty far in the Calvinist direction, so as to land you at some of those endings, or like you've just rejected it completely. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think there's no doubt. There's no taking the Calvinist out of me. I read too much Kierkegaard too young.
Nice.
But now that you say that you studied with Gary Lutz, like I see a lot more of that in your writing, like at least at the sentence level. And like, I am super interested in like because his stories or his work in general at the craft level just seems very unique, right? And that he's doing something no one else is doing. And I feel like that a lot about your work, and especially the way that you published things. And you kind of say this in one of the stories, or a character called you says this in one of the stories, but it's like you're not aiming to be that New York Times bestseller, like write some popular feel good story. You're writing with a different aim in mind. And I feel like Gary Lutz. I don't know him. I can't call him Gary, but like,
it's okay.
But I feel like he's doing something similar to that project. There's no way he could he would approach something to be like, this is going to be a popular bestseller. But that
no,
you know,
he was. Oh, go ahead.
No, please do go ahead.
I mean, it was funny because it's very strange because aesthetically, I actually saw a continuum between him and John Ashbery. They were very different people, but their attention to language and their kind of the movements of their minds on the page actually kind of reminded me of. I saw a similarity there, and it was. I mean, working with Gary was hilarious because, none of the workshop cliches ever, worked with Gary. He was like, I'm not going to talk to you about the plot of this novel, which became my first novel. He was like, I don't even do plot. And so he would do these he would do intense copy edits. But then he would also do really weird exegesis on strange decisions I had made. Like he was like, one time he was like, I noticed that there's a character named Vinnie Domino. And immediately I thought, that's Latin, Veni Domine, meaning come Lord. And I was like, holy shit, you're right. He was like, I also did some research and I found that there was a Norwegian Christian metal band in the early 90s by that name. And I was like, you read my mind by looking at 2 words on a page.
Wow. Because there is a Norwegian metal band in this book, Ghost Engine.
Yes. Which is one of my
themes.
favorite
It's one of my
stories.
great themes.
Oh my gosh.
That's why, I mean, and that kind of attention to individual words, I mean, that's something I wanted to ask you about. Like when putting together a book of stories like this, like how much do you put into what is the first line of the book? What is the last line? What is the order of the stories? Like how much do you put stock into that stuff?
Well, I would say on a meta level, like a whole volume, I put almost no effort into it. I had until the day I sent the book out to the publisher that eventually took it, I had been planning on an entirely different order. That was I was just trying to create a certain symmetry, and I showed the manuscript to Adam Levin, who read it and was like, great stories, the order sucks, and he told me what order to put them in, and I put them in the order and I sent it out.
That sounds like the way Adam would say that. Having talked to him a little bit, like he's just pretty says it like it is kind of guy.
Yeah, he's my go-to on that. But then on the level of the story itself, for me, it's once I have the first line, the entire process is fun for me. But if I don't start out with a first line, it can take me a really, really, really long time to get the story going. The example of that is that Who's Bridesmaid story, the metal story, because that was assigned. There used to be this event in Chicago called the Dollar Store Show, where the people who threw it would email you a piece of junk from the dollar store, and mine was like a sticker with rhinestones spelling out bridesmaid. And I was like, well, clearly this is a decal of a Christian metal band that black metal bands love. You know what I mean? Which sounded like something to write about. But then...
And that was your whole premise for that story.
Yeah, that was the entire birth of the premise. But Amazing. You get the constraint on that event, the Dollar Store Show, was that you had 1 month to come up with the entire story. And I think I found the first line on the... 3 days before. It was after that. It was easy to write. It was just I had to find a line.
John Updike said something similar when he write. I mean, I hate to be bringing up John Updike, but he does say something similar about writing, and that if he doesn't really revise many stories, is wholly at least. I mean, he always tweaks with them, but he said if a story doesn't pour smooth from the beginning, it probably never will.
Yep,
and that sounds a lot like what you're saying. So the order of the stories, I should back up and mention for people who are listening and have not read this book, which they all should now go out and buy the book Ghost Engine. There are 16 stories in the book, and they're, I would say, linked stories in some way, or there are links across stories. There's some recurring vignettes for sure. There are 4 stories that are these characters, Frag and Watt, who are trying to build a ghost engine or trying to get the ghost engine to work. And then some other links, some other recurring characters like the Ultimate Warrior and
Man, Christian, you sent me into like a serious nosedive of like internet research on the Ultimate Warrior after reading this, which was great, by the way. Like really brought me back to my childhood watching WWF wrestling in the 80s.
I mean, I grew up in Texas, so I was a wrestling fan, so I already had done all the research. You know.
Sure, yeah.
I'm sorry. And then the one of the longest stories in the book, Gordon Gartrell explains the difference. Gartrell shows up kind of in that Who's Bridesmaids story anyways. And so I want to ask you about that sort of linking. Let's go back to the Frag and Watt, because I think this is kind of one of the cores of the book. These are two guys, and like when I first saw Watt, I thought Beckett, right? But then I'm like, Fragonard, I'm like, fuck, isn't that like a painter, right? It's like this old-timey French painter, right? And so then I looked it up, and I was like, well, there's this other painter of the same era, Watteau, right? So I assume it's like Fragonard and Watteau, because you put that in the dedication, right? Watteau. And I was like, well, these guys, like, what is the connection here? And now that you're talking about Gary Lutz, I really see, like, you know, a lot of this is metaphor to get at something kind of indirectly or obliquely, and it's just kind of like, I don't want you to spoil it for us, but like, can you at least just talk around the margins of like, what are you kind of indirectly going around with these two guys who are like mechanics?
Sure. Yeah, I'm perfectly happy to talk about it, because, like, I mean, if you like, I don't think this is the kind of book you worry about plot spoilers or anything.
I don't like a short story collection. It's kind of spoiler free in a way inherently.
But right? I mean, it's more just like, I'm asking you to say like,
sure,
you know, it's a metaphor for something, and I'm not. It feels shitty to just be like, okay, what's it a metaphor for? You know what I mean? Like, I'm not just gonna.
No, totally, yeah. It's. I mean, Frag and Watt actually came out of a game that my next youngest brother used to play, which is going to make us sound like total dorks, but we were backpacking around Europe.
Do you know who you're talking to right now?
We were backpacking around Europe, and we just got into our heads it's kind of like a comedy routine that we would do with each other, because you're always in museums,
right?
And you're always seeing like the masterpieces of world art, and Fragonard and Watteau are kind of like the top of this one completely decadent school of painting called Rococo that it's incredibly technically proficient. It's super ornamental, but has like nothing of substance, you know?
Hedonistic, right?
Yeah, totally. It's like that the painting that they keep mentioning, it's called The Swing, but it's often referred to as Happy Accident. It's like, that's the vision they keep having. It's just a dude in a garden looking up a girl's skirt as she swings.
Right, yeah.
And but what we would do was try to, while goofing off about them, try to insinuate some greater depth to these two characters who just paint like frilly seashells. You know what I mean? And so when I was deciding to write these pieces, I just decided that I would take that structure from my brother and you know, I was trying to kind of provide a philosophical framework for the book. But the first one I think is pretty easy, the one with the starfish story. Yeah. But as it goes on, the philosophical aspect gets more and more muddled and complex, and because that's what happens as frameworks and systems develop. And so, you know, basically to me, what I say is that they're basically they're Rococo painters, but they're also basically chatbots pining about having bodies, you know? And so that kind of describes the arc of the book for me.
I think that's brilliant. And the thing that they're trying to bring to life, I mean, I guess that's one of... I actually will ask Dave what you think the Ghost engine is, or what it does. And like, is it an engine that generates life, or just afterlife, or is it the soul? Like, what was your take on it, Dave?
Well, I'm not quite sure. It's been, I think, around a month or so since I finished reading it. So like the very fine particulars of that are like slightly hazier than they were then.
We can edit this out. You can just say that, oh, you read it today.
Christian, you tell me the answer, and then we'll cut that out, and then
we'll edit
say
that
it, and I'll sound really smart. But it will say, like, it reminded me in a really cool way of a book that I love by Chris Adrian called Gob's Grief.
Oh yeah.
Have you read that?
Yep.
Where a boy loses his twin brother in the Civil War, and he tries to build a resurrection machine to bring him back from the dead, like physically. So it reminded me of that kind of like magically real aspects of that book. But I don't know if I have a great answer, Matt, to the question of what does the Ghost Engine do? I don't know if it's a spoiler to say if that even gets resolved or not for us.
Oh, I would say it does not. I mean, I think it's
totally.
It's very metaphorical and like I guess what you're saying about the painters themselves being people just in complete pursuit of pleasure. I mean, I thought of them as like, before I even thought of them as painters, I thought of them as like writers trying to bring to life like a story, or bring to life like a piece of art, or to imbue that with life in some way. And you hear that a lot of like, I'm trying to make it work, right? Like that's the whole point of going to a writing workshop, right? Is like get something and then try to make it work or make it better. And some things don't get off the ground. And like there's another story in here I was going to ask you about, where there's two little kids who do get something off the ground. and I was like, when I was reading this story, I think it's called The Wrong Mother. And I was like, is this those two guys? Is this Frag and Watt as little kids?
Huh.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, man.
Or is this something... because there's a lot of like couples in this book, or like pairs and like twins. And what was your thinking, like consciously or subconsciously there, I guess, about like having these two guys? I guess you just said like it's kind of like your brother, right? Like you and your brother were going around, you kind of have this internal like private joke, but these two guys, they're not explicitly brothers. Like they're... What did you mean by chatbots? I guess like because they do just kind of talk about random like pop culture shit sometimes.
Well, chatbots, like I have never actually engaged a chatbot online, at least not knowingly. But I'm really fascinated by these experiments. You can find them on YouTube, where people put chatbots in conversation with each other.
Okay.
So these are like, they're supposedly artificial intelligences, but I don't know what that really means. But they basically draw their existence from words on the internet, and so it's basically two different computers full of the internet talking back and forth to each other. And so it's the second epigraph to the book. I think it's "Don't you want to have a body?" "Don't you want to have a body?"
One chatbot to another.
Yeah, that was actually, I found that on the internet, like two chatbots talking to each other, and they got in an argument. They called each other liars, and then talked about how badly they wanted to have bodies.
That's amazing. So maybe the Ghost Engine is the AI. The AI is trying to create a way for them into the human world, into a human body.
Well, yeah, I mean, for me, it's the weird thing is it goes to this like kind of argument that I have with myself. Like I had a ton of fun writing this book.
I bet.
But
that
I also
comes through
got
really
to
clearly.
a point where I felt like I could kind of do the stuff that I wanted. You know what I mean? And so I'm really against perfection and shininess in fiction. And so there was kind of this struggle that I was having where I wanted to keep things messy. And I was thinking about how, this is not, culturally, this is not my ideal world, but like the mechanics of this world really are something that I love. I love having a body, and I also love books. You know what I mean? And I would never want a book to replace the pleasures of a body. You know what I mean? And yet people want, to some degree, a kind of sensual pleasure from the act of reading. And so I was kind of, riffing on that between the two of them.
One thing around Frag and Watt, and that is like a big theme of Toughlahoma as well, is violence. And I can like totally see how you and Adam are great friends, because his book is like rife with teenage violence and acts of violence against inanimate objects like swing sets and things like that. So there's all this like back and forth violence between Frag and Watt in those sections. And Kyle, when he was talking about Toughlahoma with us in his episode, he called it the most mind-boggling work of incredibly endearing, semi-evangelical religious allegory, batshit crazy fabulous. Yeah, you should read it. That was like his endorsement for the book. And so like I wonder about the role of violence in your work, and about the themes that you're working with, kind of in the same way that Adam maybe likes to as well.
Yeah, sure. I think I would say that Ghost Engine and Toughlahoma, I finished Toughlahoma first, by far, but they were kind of started roughly around the same time.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And Toughlahoma, I kind of let it take over at a certain point because I kind of had a certain framework that I was using that was fun for me. But I also had a kid during that time. Like I had a couple of the stories in Ghost Engine and a couple chapters of Toughlahoma. And so there was this weird thing going on when I was writing Toughlahoma, where I was still writing a lot of violence, but also thinking about the state of nature. Because I know Matt has a kid who's the same age as mine. So you've watched a lot of different people in that one body. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Like, so when, I was writing Toughlahoma when my son was an actual infant. So I watched him acquire language, but also I watched him acquire morality. You know what I mean? And Toughlahoma was kind of like an imagination of like a civilization that never gets civilized, full of people that never become ethical,
Right.
And that was probably the most violent thing I've ever written. And there are still vestiges of that in Ghost Engine. But to me, like, this kind of question of ethics took over, so that the violence is more sporadic rather than more the point of things.
Right.
And it's, for me, it's just a fact of life. I was never one of these, I never ran around street fighting on, as a pastime or anything like that. But my parents were ministers in a Rust Belt city. My dad still is. And, there more than one person tried to kill me in my childhood. You know what I mean? And
like, as a targeted active, like by your affiliation with your parents, do you mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
My parents were real big social justice activists in the community, and they were widely loved in the community, but they pissed people off sometimes. You know what I mean?
Right. I read that your dog got kidnapped. You'd mentioned in another interview. And like semi-poisoned or something. Jeez.
Yeah. So we had a dog napping, and various different situations where there were actual threats to our lives, and points, scary times. And so it's not like I go around being like, oh, violence is this thing that I'm passionate about exploring, but it's just part of my my understanding of the way the world works.
And you almost did punch out Jonathan Safran Foer at a party
that didn't happen. No, see, that's the thing is, Adam we were in grad school together, Adam Levin and I had actually met Jonathan Safran Foer when I was in college. Bradford Morrow had actually brought him up just to meet us he was at Princeton at the time. I just found him really snooty. Like, I was trying to be nice, and I was drunk, by the way, but I was like, you go to Princeton? And he was like, yeah. And I was like, is it, firstly, my parents met at Princeton Seminary, so I know the place, but I don't know the school, and I was like, is it anything like, I was drunk. I said, The Other Side of Paradise by F. Scott Fitzgerald. He was like, he gave me this blank look, and I was like, oh, sorry, I'm drunk. I mean, this side of paradise. And suddenly he pretended he knew what I was talking about. And I was like, what, do you think you're better than me?
Like a Robert De Niro kind of voice.
Yeah. And then 5 years later, I tell Adam that story. And the occasion of telling that was that we opened up the New Yorker, and he was in the debut fiction issue. And Adam turned it into this brawl, which he then went and told everybody about. And
he would do that, turn it into a brawl.
Yeah.
So I gotta say, my one interaction with him was at the memorial service for David Foster Wallace at NYU.
He was there too
in 2008. And he was still married to Nicole Krauss, and they actually sat like right behind me, and I was sitting with my friend Michael, and like I just wanted to talk so much shit about that guy, and we had to wait until like we were polite and said hello, and like And then we got to a bar later that night, and Michael and I were like, "That guy's such a fucking lightweight." And like it was like we had this pent up like frustration that we couldn't vent until we were like safely far away from him. But my father was also a minister when I was growing up to the age of 10 or 11. He
got a couple of PKs here.
He changed.
Yeah, this is wild, man.
Changed career paths. Dave does have a kid too, by the way, and
okay.
Yeah, she's 3.
My oldest is. I actually have 2. My oldest is 13, and like seeing those sort of different lives, that actually makes me see Toughlahoma in a different way. And I almost feel like we're focused on Ghost Engine here today, but I almost feel like we should like talk to you again and just talk about Toughlahoma, because Dave and I both really enjoyed that book.
Yeah,
and we had
it's
kind of private correspondence about that book as well. So I would say anyone who's interested in your work, definitely pick up these 2 books. But you've actually published
like 5
several
or 6
other
total,
books, right?
Yeah.
And the trajectory of your career, I guess, a lot of people get asked this question of like, do you see yourself mainly writing short stories or novels?
Well, I strongly prefer writing short stories. Like I have the most fun writing short stories. But I've come to accept that like sometimes I have like ideas that take longer to write. And what I tend to do is just I use short stories as this kind of break from novels. And when I get it, I mean, it's weird because I have another novel coming out in the fall, and I just came out with Ghost Engine.
This fall you have it coming out.
Yeah.
Amazing. What's it called?
It's called The Apology.
Okay. Great.
It's about office politics.
The Pale King reloaded a little bit.
Yeah. But this, if I could just write short stories, if I never had novel ideas, that would be heavenly. But it also, I mean, I've really published literally every short story that I ever felt was finished, and that's 2 slim volumes in 20 years. You know what I mean? So,
well, in you saying that it was like messiness there, I got to say this felt like super polished to me. I didn't see any signs of messiness at all.
It's tight and sonnet.
But what you're saying about The Office, it reminds me one of my favorite lines in this book, which is from one of the other like long stories called Hard Times in Galt's Gulch. He said, like, I've never read a fiction writer who showed any evidence he'd ever seen the inside of an office. I love that because, that's like, I'm not a writer. I have an office job, although it's now a work from home job like everyone else. And I totally agree. And like whatever gets called like the great novels of The Office are like just totally ring false to me. And so I'm really looking forward to whatever your next book turns out to be. The Apology, I guess it's done, right? Like you said.
Yeah, I just submitted the final edits last week.
Wow.
Congrats. I'm keeping my eyes peeled for that.
So that story, Hard Times in Galt's Gulch, that to me is one of the best stories in here, and that
this is the Ayn Rand book club story.
Yeah.
Oh man, love it.
I got the book slightly before Dave, and like I sent him a photo of this opening page of this book because I was like laughing my ass off. The first line of the book is like "fuck you, TeBordo," and like I was like, this is great. It can only get better from here, right? And obviously, like Galt's Gulch, I knew it was going to be like Ayn Rand reference. Ayn Rand, I'm sorry. But I wanted to ask you the dedicate or the kind of dedication line there is after Castellanos, Moya after Bernhard, which is like 2 of my favorite writers. And Dave and I have a thing, or I've told Dave this many times, is like when we're talking to a writer, and this is advice for anyone who goes to like a reading, don't ask a writer about any other book except for the book that they're there to talk about, like, period. And it's like, forget, no other books exist at that moment. Like, do not. But I have to ask you about that line, the dedication to it, and like what if there's any sort of like interesting backstory for this, where this story came from.
Well, I'd say, yeah. I mean, I would hope it's interesting, but I'd had the idea for the story for a really long time, and I was kind of just trying to write it as a straight story. And then obviously I think I read Bernhard for the first time when I was in like high school. You know, I love Bernhard, but it never occurred to me to borrow from him for this particular story. And then my friend Lee Klein published a translation of Castellanos Moya's book El Asco, which is translated as Thomas Bernhard in El Salvador, with new directions. And he had sent me a draft of it while he was still trying to look for the rights to it. And when it came out, I reread the final version, and I was like, oh, I'm just going to straight rip this off. I'm going to, and I was like, find somebody that hates me as much as, as Bernhard and Castellanos Moya hate, you know what I mean? And so that's where I was like, the first line should be "fuck you, TeBordo," and I stole a bunch of gestures from those guys and just wrote, and it was pretty easy after that.
So the conceit of it is that it's like your ex-girlfriend is writing to you like, 10, 15 years later after the end of the relationship, and she's just like calling you a fraud, basically.
Yeah.
It had also, to me, a little bit shades of like Good Old Neon by Wallace. The idea of fraudulence being like a big thematic aspect of the story. But yeah, like
absolutely, yeah. And I think it's weird because I see a lot of. It's funny because I don't tend to think of Bernhard and Wallace together often, except when it comes to Oblivion, which there are several stories that look very, very heavily influenced by Bernhard in that collection.
Well, in fact, Good Old Neon first appeared in Conjunctions with the 50th, I think the 50th issue, 50th anniversary issue.
Oh, wow.
So Brad Morrow first published that, and I remember going to St. Mark's Books in the East Village to buy that issue of Conjunctions, and just to read the new Wallace story and like, I thought that was one of his best works.
Yeah, absolutely.
But Bernhard, for people who haven't read him, I mean, I just probably this year read Gargoyles, and like, I can kind of see why you have like an interest in him, and that he also has a pretty bleak, like you were saying with Saunders, it's like it all works out in the end. It's like it does not with Bernhard. It's like it's never even set up to work out for the best ever. It's a pretty bleak like worldview with that guy.
What's your line, Christian? On page 179, I have it here. I am mediocrity at best, but I have some principles. My principles tell me that the redemption we need is bigger than any one of us. If the revelation ever comes, it's going to be very loud and very fucking ugly. So Saunders might have a more delicate form of redemption or revelation that isn't quite so aggressive. But so yeah, similar parallel there.
Yeah, he studied Buddhism and stuff. It's different from Calvinism.
That is true.
Yeah, and that story you mentioned some real world people in there, like I guess Bernhard and Castellanos Moya mentioned real people, but like how much of that is true? I guess we'll just ask you, like, they went to your high school, Jim Scott, Eulabis.
We were all in the same class in high school. Yeah, it's weird because my parents. There's a whole weird background thing here. My parents were ministers in this town called Cohoes, and they had actually accepted a new job at a church in a small town out of Rochester, New York, and then our house burned down, and they took it as a sign from God that we should stay here. And so what they did was they had insurance money all of a sudden, so they got us a house in the suburbs that they stayed in long enough to get us through the really good public school system in the suburbs, at which point they went back to the manse in Cohoes. But so yeah, for that few years, I was in basically every class with both Eula and Jim, and they were great kids.
Okay, so they show up in the story, like in the line, if Jim and Eula won't reply to your emails, you'll have to do it yourself. Copy and paste this motherfucker into one of your books. A mediocrity within a mediocrity. So like very delicious meta fictional stuff. Like you're writing yourself. It's like a takedown of yourself, I think. The idea is about going to college, grad school, publishing a couple books no one will ever read, fancy professorship, job for life. That's Mediocrity TeBordo, which is the old version of mediocrity, page 173. So
Yeah,
I love the self-deprecating stuff that you have going on in that story.
Yeah, well, I would say all of the beats of my own life that I put in that story are roughly biographically correct. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I had a feeling maybe.
I invented a lot of stuff around it. So like I never had that girlfriend, you know what I mean? And I wanted I wanted to invent this girlfriend who was way cooler than me, who had a dim view of me. And the whole point for the narrative take for me for the story was I am the second section where I talk about Jim and Eula in my own quote unquote my own voice is biographically correct, except I never tore apart a Barnes and Noble, anything like that.
Right.
But like, I mean, the broad strokes there are correct, but I tried to write it in a voice that sounded like the voice that the girlfriend was imputing to me. So I was like, I will be the petty, bitter mediocrity that she describes. You know what I mean?
Totally. And now that I've broken my rule about asking about other writers, we've mentioned at least 4 of them right now.
But anyone's foregrounded coming on a show that's typically about Wallace anyways, right? So you have to know that going in with us.
I guess.
I'll talk about anybody.
I'm just telling you, this is a lesson I've learned the hard way, and I'd still, even if I break it, I have to acknowledge it. So I have to ask you about the question, the story, How We Lived on Main Street. And I think there's a lot of metaphor going on in this story, especially the idea of we have never lived in the castle, which I'm assuming we have always lived in the castle is Shirley Jackson reference. And, what's one of my favorite writers, I'm like in a big Shirley Jackson phase right now. The movie just came out with Elizabeth Moss. That like what's going on there, like between Main Street and the castle? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's not right.
And how does Baudrillard factor into it as well, I might ask? Like the procession of simulacrum enter into this story? Because he writes about Main Street, USA in that famous essay.
Yep. Yeah. It's weird. So that Main Street is for me, the chronological first in a series. All of the short stories, the very short ones in the collection that aren't about Frag and Watt, each of those, I think there are 6 of them, and each of them represents a different land in Disney World.
Holy shit. That is Baudrillard.
So for example, you had mentioned The Wrong Mother earlier about the boys who get the flying bicycle off the ground.
It's like Dumbo.
That was my representation of those. Yeah, it's kind of like the Dumbo ride, but the rocket ship ride in Tomorrowland.
Oh yeah.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah, and then there's the Bear Country is the Country Bear Jamboree.
Oh my gosh.
Et cetera, et cetera. So,
I totally missed this, man. I
was,
feel like a terrible reader right now. I totally missed this.
Oh, dog, there's no expectation there.
I was excited to reread Ghost Engine, and now I'm like super psyched to reread Ghost Engine.
But yeah, I mean, the idea was, so those other stories, the thematic links where characters show up was one way I was messing with pop culture, and the other was trying to create the most perverse version without seeming perverse of Disney World, you know? Like I didn't want to be like, I didn't want to do like transgressive fiction with like blood and guts and stuff, but I wanted to be like, well, how did the Swiss Family Robinson plan to propagate the species? You know what I mean? That kind of thing.
Oh shit. I love that story, American Family Robinson.
Yeah, that's great.
Thanks.
Which the first part of it, this is a house surrounded by fires, the internet goes out. I was like, this could actually be like a pandemic story, like at the beginning.
Totally.
There's some great lines in that. I actually really love this line from that story that says, later that night, I stood on the back deck and watched my parents swim naked in the pool by the light of the not too distant fires. Like that one sentence I felt like could be a short story, like Gary Lutz.
Nice. Well, thank you.
And then like later in that sentence, you said it's like uprooted the Garden of Eden and grafted it into hell. So it's like surrounded by fire around the neighborhood. Yeah, that's a great story. And it's like, it struck me that story was so different stylistically than every other story in the book. And so there's like this lovely moment of like Wow, there's like a very significant form of range going on throughout this collection.
Yeah, well, I mean, with that one, like I mess around with that outside of the text as well, like because you're correct that there is some like Baudrillardian messing around. I'm not a big literary theory guy, but the simulacrum thing is something that's on my mind sometimes.
Yeah.
But with that one, because it's narrated by a woman and there's no really no way of expressing that when I'm doing like a public reading. Like I had a public reading where I was in the audience, but I didn't show up for my reading, and had a friend of mine, Jamie Fontaine, who's an incredible writer, just walk up to the mic and do the reading for me and stuff.
Some JT Leroy shit there. And one thing I loved about that story too was at the beginning, the father, after he's sort of stuck in his quarantine, right, in pandemic house, starts painting this huge mural on the basement, and it says he just kind of took up painting, and I felt like the thing that he paints is this sort of, canopy, this dense sort of tropical jungle. And it's like, even though he had, what's the line? It's a tropical scene that betrayed a lack of training and the fact that he'd never been to the tropics. And I actually felt like this was a metaphor for like creation, right? And that this is like, they are creating a new world, and, this is the Garden of Eden, or this is like, God creating the world, who also had no experience, as far as we know, like creating another world. And I thought that was a super interesting idea. I'd never thought about before, like the creator not having any experience with creation, but being like really good at it.
Yeah, and the other thing is that putting stuff like that in also kind of, Martin Amis has this riff about, as a craftsman, one thing you could do is, if there's stuff you're not very good at, really, is just announce it. You know what I mean? And so when I'm obviously being fictional, sometimes I hold back for the most part on the kind of metafictional gesture these days, except I couldn't hold off with the Gulch story.
Right.
But for the most part, like I will put something like that in there, and it's a kind of way. It's also to distract you from the fact that here I am trying to write about sisterhood when I've never been a sister. You know what I mean? And so it's kind of like a way of acknowledging that I'm making this is an artifice.
Wow, I thought that you pulled that off extremely well, and I did make a note in the margin, like when you said my sister and I. And I was like, okay, to me, that's enough to say that, like, this is probably, a woman writing this. But I was immediately looking for that cue just as a reader of like, okay, what am I, what am I reading here? Is this a man? Like, probably not. But that scene, I thought, where the sister, I should say the narrator, really goes into the sister's room and sees her like burning up her own writing. And the narrator says something like, the world's ending, mom and dad have lost it. And it's like, that's actually my life right now. And the world's ending, mom and dad have lost it. And like, what's the point of writing? Like I feel like that one question's on my mind is like, what's it like trying to write these days, right? Like what does it feel like to, it's like cliche to say like, oh, we're living in some kind of like DeLillo novel or something, but it's how do you create fiction that gives meaning to people who are actually experiencing things like this right now?
Well, it's weird because I do think that I have a different take on fiction than I think is being asked for right now. Not from you, but from the culture at large. I recall I teach a seminar in the 18th century novel to my grad students, and I consider my job to get them comfortable with ambiguity. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And part of that is on the textual level. Like, we just don't know if Don Quixote is a madman or not. You know what I mean? But then part of that is on just a way of moving forward as a fiction writer and as a human being, So I've joked that as a writer with depressive tendencies, lockdown is not that hard for me. It's raising a child in lockdown is a much different issue. You
Right.
know what I mean? But writing fiction for me is it's a bummer. Those times when you think, oh, this development in society, such as lockdown, which seems to have been messing with book sales and the publishing industry, et cetera, is going to make it even harder to place my next book. You know what I mean? That's it's a thought that I have, and I also recognize it as a fairly petty thought. You know what I mean? But I do think that the way I think about fiction is as a way of learning to live in ambiguity and learning to not have answers and to accept that. But also, I mean, like the to get explicitly political, I think that the neoliberal political project is the goal is to fully atomize us and finally liquidate us. You know what I mean? So this kind of sense of isolation and aloneness feels like practice for what will happen if we don't change something soon. You know what I mean?
Wow. Yeah. I haven't thought about the liquidation part.
I'm sorry, guys.
No. I haven't thought about the liquidation part of it, but I mean, that's not to put too fine a point on it, but that is, I think that's on a lot of people's minds right now. So that makes sense. And I don't know if I guess, as a writer, I think of myself primarily as a reader. And like, for me, reading has been really hard, and I'm trying to figure out why. Like during these few months, I thought like, oh, I'm stuck at home. I'm just getting a ton of reading done. It's not like
I've heard a lot of people say this.
Shit ton of books in here that I haven't read, that I want to read. You know what I mean? And I think, maybe some of it is like I'm so used to, my routines are off, and I'm so used to running around and being like from here to there, and like my mind just can't adapt to being in one physical place. But is that, I guess, most writers, or not most writers, a lot of writers find, they do most of their writing at home anyways. So it's not necessarily true with reading. Like you could go to a park and go to a coffee shop. I think it'd be very hard to write at a coffee shop, personally.
I only write in coffee shops.
Oh, fuck.
Oh, yeah, that's cool.
God damn, you just ruined my whole train of thought.
Oh, no, go on. I'm sorry.
No. So that's interesting to me because coffee shops here closed. You can't sit in them, right? And so people are stuck at home, and like, I don't know. If either of you felt this like lack of being able to, I don't know if it's the content of the books that I've been trying to read. It's very hard to like, I just feel like I've been bouncing around by being at home now. I'm going on like 4 months.
Huh.
Yeah, you've been at it a long time, longer than I have, by about a month or two, I think, Matt. I've felt reading to be like okay during this period, but I also think that it probably has to do with my geography right now a little bit, being in like tucked away in the bottom corner of the world where social issues are not quite so pronounced at the moment, and COVID is like under control. And so I don't think like I get the distraction aspect of that.
Do you seriously only write in
way.
coffee shops? Are you fucking with me? Are you serious?
Well, no, I'm actually, I'm capable of writing outside of coffee shops, but no, there's a weird thing. I like being alone, but I also like being among people.
Do you need like the hum of human energy around you? Like, does it kind of like energize you in some way?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. There's the coffee shop I write at in Chicago. It's actually a bakery. It's called Letizia's, and it's in the Wicker Park neighborhood, which is like a former cool neighborhood, but it's not like a cool coffee shop. It's like people come in and get their pastries. So there's like a hum around me, but like no one there is trying to talk to me or anything like that. So I have noise and bustle, but everybody just leaves me alone. And that's kind of like the ideal situation for writing for me. But I've been able to get some writing done at home. Schooling your child while trying to make room for me and my wife to both have our jobs is a bigger obstacle to actual like writing time. But as far as reading, I think I made a super corny decision. Like I read The Plague again the day that quarantine started. Like they told us we were locked down, and I was like, I guess I'm reading The Plague. And I found it to be this kind of like incredibly fortifying and encouraging book. which led me to just find books that I thought were going to be, from my childhood or like had just always thought would just be like dark and dreary. And I read a bunch of depressing stuff that actually ended up buoying me for months, to where reading just stayed part of what I do,
Hey, that's pretty nice.
Well, and I should say there is some Camus in this book. And
Right, yeah, the myth of Sisyphus.
Yeah, the myth of Sisyphus, which honestly took me a second to process, right? Because it's like, in a way, a triple negative, right? Like,
Totally. I struggle with triple negatives too, Matt.
It's like, well, cool. I don't, because what Camus is saying, right? You have to imagine Sisyphus is happy, and you're like, no, that's a myth. But then there's the myth of Sisyphus. I'm like, is that, I guess, a metaphor for art as well, or am I just like grasping at straws here?
Well, it's there's like you were right when you guys were kind of talking about Ghost Engine. There's a really, really easy metaphor that I feel like people are scared to just say to me because it sounds too obvious. But the book is a ghost engine. You know what I mean?
There you go.
And so this kind of like the dancing around the Camus to me is them kind of coming to a realization. Remember that books and life are two different things, and like a book is a thing that exists in life, And I read Kierkegaard and Camus. That they were my adolescent rebellion, like no joke. My dad, is he's a proper evangelical, but. So I popped The Cure standing on a beach into the tape deck one day when I was in 9th grade, and he heard it and he was like, "This is existential garbage." And I was like, "Hey, Dad, what's existential garbage?" And he told me, like Kierkegaard and Camus. And so I read Kierkegaard and Camus. But I've always come out on the side of Kierkegaard,
right.
And so Camus' conclusion that one must imagine Sisyphus happy. I don't know what, for me, it seems like a kind of, pulled out of the air, kind of like, oh, this is a way to stay alive. But to me, you go back and read the Greek myths, Sisyphus is dead. You know what I mean? So it doesn't matter if he's happy or sad, So for me, the point is that life is good,
Now that's fascinating because you're right. No one ever goes back and just says like, oh, actually he dies. Like the point of it, he's not eternally just pushing up a hill, right? I mean, which is anyone's, I guess, that's a matter of disposition, I guess. Like, are you naturally predisposed to viewing your life that way as a writer? I think there are people who are, right? Like depressives. I think Wallace was a depressive. We're like past an hour right now. I'll just go and tell you, but I think we haven't even got to ask you, like, what is your take on Wallace? Like,
what's your hot take?
Do you mind asking just like in general, since we have you, I don't know when else we'll get to chat again. So
since Kyle made that really cryptic statement to us about what your view is. Yeah. Well, we built suspense for an hour for our listeners and ourselves. So drop it on us.
All right. I'm not sure what anybody's referring to when they talk about my take on Wallace, because I've said a lot of stuff about that dude over the years. I read Wallace contemporaneously, starting with Infinite Jest. You know what I mean? I love his fiction, and I particularly love his short stories, which I go back to all the time. And I think probably what Kyle is referring to is like, we really did, like, our relationship started with me being like, I just read your review of The Pale King, and I saw some kids trying to dunk on it online, but I think you're pretty close to right, and I would like to your help refining my feelings about this.
Yeah.
And we just kind of went back and forth. And I think what people very close to me would be saying when they say that I have a strange take on Wallace is that I also really like Bret Easton Ellis.
Okay, yeah.
And I think for me, Ellis is his outlook on life is his outlook on life as expressed in his fiction. His online persona is ridiculous, you know what I mean? But
right, yeah.
The way he expresses things in his fiction makes a lot of sense to me, and so attacks on his outlook seem like they have a hurdle to clear when I see them. And so I think Wallace's view of empathy is something that's really, really reducible. And I'm suspicious of empathy, and I'm lucky because having grown up with minister parents, I've always had compassion as my go-to, you know what I mean? And so compassion is difficult to do, but not hard to theorize, you know? It means just loving people. Yeah. Whereas empathy is like trying to feel everything. And then like what I see, like the people that talk about empathy often seem like, very, very picky and choosy about who they're empathetic with. And the example that I use in a really, really easy way is one of the examples that he uses in the graduation speech, you know, where he kind of ends up saying like, you know, imagine that the people have motives that you'd be comfortable with, and that's why they're behaving that way. You know what I mean? It's like,
like the SUV driver who's like racing to the hospital because their kid's sick or whatever.
Right. And it's like, well, why could the world still be beautiful if somebody actually just wanted to cut you off with their SUV? You know what I mean? And I think it can, you know?
You know, it's funny. I was thinking about that story today. I mean, that specific example in the speech today and I thought it was a little different than empathy of like, oh, have empathy for other people because you don't know the whole story. And I guess I focused more on that part of like, you don't know the whole story. And like that part of it intrigues me. And like there was a controversy in Austin this week where some guy on Twitter was going through the Austin police budget and found there was a line item that was like $3,000 for puffed cheese snacks. And he tweeted at the Austin Police Department like, "Are you fucking kidding me? Like $3,000 for Cheetos? Like you crazy ass." And it's like, it seems crazy.
So like when we say defund the police, like that's a good place to start.
But it's like on its face, that's ridiculous. Like why is the APD spending $3,000 on Cheetos? And the APD responds on Twitter and says, actually, that is money we got from a grant to buy shelf-stable snacks for a battered women's shelter. And it was... And it's just like, oh, well, fuck. We actually... something on its face that seems like really annoying or offensive. And it's like, I'm not trying to have empathy for the cops, but it's just like, you don't know the whole story. And something that seems on its face absurd or like super fucking ridiculous actually has a legit reason to it. And like that sort of like double bind things, I think that's what interested Wallace. Like, I'm not defending him, but like I think
no, I think
I've read
I think there's absolutely, I mean, like I think there's a case to be made. Graduation speeches are graduation speeches, you know what I mean? But also I think there's absolutely a case to be made for most of what he says. And I think, you know, my dad would probably wish I would write something like that than what I usually write, you know? But,
fuck you, Dad. I wrote a story about a Cosby show.
And Christian metal. Yeah.
But like, I think what I was really pushing back against was that they were, you know, it's weird because this was 7, 8, 9 years ago now, and now his reputation is nearly the opposite. And I was like, why would we want to make him a saint, and why would we want to make him a devil? You know what I mean? He was like a really, really complicated dude and a really complicated writer, and I would much rather engage that way, you know?
Yeah, totally. I mean, believe me, that the whole just even moralizing it all has made it difficult to be a fan of someone, you know? And you know, this idea of like Wallace, in one of his interviews, he's asked if he ever like got to meet his literary heroes, and he mentions like DeLillo and Cormac McCarthy and stuff, and he's like, yes, I did get to meet those guys, but honestly, I didn't even want to chat with them because it makes them more like different than the voice that's in their writing. And like, I felt like this tension right after Wallace died of like the people who wanted to focus on the person and the people who wanted to focus on the writing. And I feel like it's high-minded of me to say like, oh, I'm one of the ones who wanted to focus on just on his writing. It's like bullshit. People are not just writing. You know what I mean? Like, we're talking to you as a human being right now. If we just wanted to engage with your work, like, I guess I could go put this on my blog and email you some questions and never, I don't know. I mean, how do you feel about this? I mean, I'm not even sure where I stand on it. I feel very conflicted about it because I do, we've already talked about like, okay, George Saunders, I did meet him one time and talk to him, and like literally like most generous person I've ever met. But that's not like a reflection of his writing, right? Like, do I like everything he's written? No. That's a different, I don't know. That's a different feeling than like he's a super generous guy. And like, I guess I would rather there be more people like that. I've had writers who I think are total dicks, and I'm not going to name them, but like Wallace was kind of one of them. He was actually a dick to me.
Yeah, I was going to say.
And I've told that story, and I've told a couple of other stories about him where it's like, he's kind of a dick to me, but it's like, so what? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's strange because, we live our lives. I think a writer of my quote unquote stature should not know anybody. You know what I mean? And because we live our lives in public in a way that previous generations of writers and readers haven't, I think there's a greater concern with that kind of thing. But, I really, really, and it may be because when we were going through the hagiographic stage where he was just being sainted, I was like, I know him not to have been this person that you're making him. You know what I mean? And part of that was because, I studied with Mary Carr at Syracuse, and I was the doofus that was like, hey, why can't David Foster Wallace ever come here? You know what I mean?
Oh no.
And so like, well, I mean, Mary's cool. You know what I mean? She didn't, I didn't know why David Foster Wallace would never be there. You know
yeah,
I mean?
Exactly. Yeah.
It's
so like, well, actually, here's the history.
Yeah. Yeah. She explained it to me, and it was like, oh, well, this is something that I have to kind of process with regard to this dude. And so like, my sense of a writer as a hero is really, really only textual, but I absolutely have to process that shit when I learn about it, and but in the same way, I think I was maybe angrier at the world that was trying to make him a saint than it's trying to make him a devil, because I don't think his work's going away. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think we have both of those levels, and it's kind of evened out to where we have if you're going to do biographical criticism, which is just not my thing, you have all the elements of it now,
True. Yeah.
Can I ask what she said? What did she say?
I think she just said she had a restraining order against him, if I remember correctly. So it was like, I was not going to push anything deeper. But it was but she was chill about it. She wasn't like, don't read that guy, or, don't ask me about that guy or anything. You know what I mean?
Oh no. She wrote about him after he died.
Right.
And,
right.
I did ask her about this. And I think she still gets asked about it, right? Like, she'll be asked about it today. And I think you're right. She's not going to be like, oh, you don't ask me that. Because I think there's part of her who's also like, she has some, I don't know, appreciation for him. Like, I mean, she's a Catholic, right? So she believes in forgiveness. She believes in some kind of redemption. And she has a very different worldview. And she didn't, when I asked her about David Foster Wallace, she didn't seem bitter at all. She didn't seem mad or upset or taken aback or anything.
Yeah, I think, it's also worth keeping in mind that he was this is not a justification for him, but I think she was aware of him as a pretty sick guy. But Mary's a wild person. You know what I mean? Like, she's always surprising, and she's incredibly smart, but also incredibly quick. You know what I mean? And so I wouldn't, I don't think that in fact, I think she kind of encouraged us to continue reading him, but I don't think she ever would have encouraged us to try to emulate him as a writer, that is, even. I also think there's a reason for that, which is that I just don't do what he does, But she's also, she's just really funny and kind of can come out of left field. I remember on September 13th, 2001, it was my second year of graduate school, and I had just started teaching on September 11th. Wow. And she was just like, "TeBordo, I'm going to have to shoot you in the foot." And I was like, what? Fuck? And she was like, just in case there's a draft,
Right. Yeah.
She's very Texan, like she.
Yeah.
Because I do actually just happen to have this gun here on me as a result of being from Texas, being an enthusiast for guns.
Well, this has been great. I feel like the one story I wanted to ask you about, we haven't talked much about, is the Gordon Gartrell story. And like, you know, when I first read that, I was like, okay, it took me a second to realize like what was going on. And then I went and looked it up and I was like, oh, okay, this is a real episode of the Cosby Show. And the writer's name was Gordon Gartrell, and he's used as like the name of this fashion designer in the episode. But in the story, it's like there's another Gordon Gartrell who is a fashion designer who's not like, so in a way there's like a third Gordon Gartrell. I mean, what appealed to you about that story, or how did you like come across that episode from 1984?
Well, I mean, it's, you know, the Cosby Show was the first thing I ever remember thinking was funny, you know? And it was like, I must have been 5 or 6 when it aired. And that was like the first time I got to stay up past 8 o'clock, you know?
Parent
so
approved. They love that, I bet.
Yeah, exactly. So I remembered that episode forever, you know? And it was just out of like, I was just thinking, well, what if there actually already was a fashion designer named Gordon Gartrell, but he didn't want to design those? Like from then on, he's marked. You know what I mean? And that's where the story came from. And it was weird because I had no idea about Cosby's, you know, crimes at the time that I started working on that story. I started working on the story at like 2008 or 9, I think, 10 maybe. And so I was already into the story, and I was already on the path to making him the villain of the story. And then I actually had to step back when the charges came, and I was like, this is just too fucked up. You know what I mean?
Right.
But, you know, then I was like, well, this story is about Gordon Gartrell. It's not about Bill Cosby, you know? So,
So I thought it was a very timely story, right? In a way, it's a very timely story, but you didn't intend on it being that timely.
No. In fact, I'd been like, I don't think anybody will. I don't know how many people in the world that this could resonate with in any way, but yeah, it was that one. The key for me was this. Remember that? Remember when they started releasing like everything from Roberto Bolaño, and like the last one, the Problem of Evil. That wasn't the last one they released, but that one, that was just like scraps from the desktop, you know.
The Secret of Evil.
That's right, The Secret of Evil. And it was like, man, I was like, this is the first time I felt ripped off, because it's really just kind of scraps, you know. And then I got to this one story where he's describing a photograph, and I was like, I'm going to use this as my structure for the story. And obviously went my own direction with it.
I'm a huge Bolaño fan and reader, and he actually has another book coming out next year.
Oh, really?
I saw that.
Called Cowboy Graves. And I have a Bolaño blog called bolano.com, where I've cataloged everything that hasn't come out. So there's still a handful of stories and a couple of novels that have not been translated. And there's a couple that have been actually published in Spanish, but not in English. So even though this one coming out, like clearly his agent is Andrew Wiley in the U.S. and like clearly they've put together like at least one other book in addition to this one.
Wow.
But I mean, he was super prolific and like wrote in various stages of his career without publishing at all, right? So he wrote for like years without publishing and just built up this huge catalog of stuff. I'm sorry I'm going off on this tangent just because you brought it up, but I felt like that when they published The Secret of Science Fiction, I was like, man, this is actually like, it would have been fine if this is not published. Do you know what I mean? And I'm not slagging on it too much, but like a little bit where I don't know if I felt ripped off completely, but a little bit where I was like, I could do without this one, you know? Like do something interesting.
I've thought very little about that one since I read it, but I don't regret reading it. And I mean, that dude, I mean, I'm almost never in like a reading slump, but I was in a massive reading slump. And then I had not read The Savage Detectives.
I'm reading that right now.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I'm like
I love
2/3 of the way through. Okay, yeah.
but I'd been putting off on it because particularly with international novels, there seems to be this like hype machine, and I feel like it's best to wait a couple years to see if the books are actually good. You know what I mean? I did that with Knausgaard, and I liked. I didn't read My Struggle, but I read some of his early stuff and enjoyed it. But with Bolaño, I was holding off, and then I saw the cover of 2666 was just so beautiful that I picked it up. And I read the first page and I was like, okay, I'm reading this now, you know, and that not only pulled me out of my reading slump, like, because then I had like, you know, volumes and volumes of Bolaño to read,
right.
But it also blocked me as a writer for the first time. Like I get writer's block, but nothing has ever specifically just said, hey, you can't write anymore. And that book did. It was like,
yeah, that makes sense.
But
that's a pretty great book.
Well, I didn't mean to take us off on too far of a tangent there, but I find that interesting when sometimes fiction writers use that device of a photograph, right? Where you don't want to say like what a character looks like per se, but you can like have them either like look in the mirror or like look at a photograph of themselves and describe the photograph. It's sort of a kind of a way to get around that. I actually think it's super interesting in older books. I'll see this with like detective novels where, you know, the guy would like first scene like wake up and look in the mirror and describe his face, and it's like something really like noir about it, but it's like kind of a cheat for the writer to just describe the guy right. without him like just being exposition, you know. Super interesting book, Christian. I feel like we've still only scratched the surface of this. Like I love the Pete Maynard, the Pierre Menard reference, the stuff in there that's from Borges. I don't know if that fits into Disney World somewhere. It's kind of a simulacrum itself, I guess, of Moby Dick. The Quixote, we have mentioned Don Quixote today, so that's good. I actually felt like I had a Knausgaard question for you, and I've totally scrubbed it because I was like, I don't want to ask about other writers, and now I'm like, fuck, I should have wrote that down because you brought it up.
To give our listeners a bit more of a sense of your prose and your stories, Christian, would you want to read a section for us on air?
Sure.
You got something picked out?
Yeah, I was gonna read like a little bit. You read actually one of the sentences, but
oh, did I?
I'll read the whole. It's like just 2 paragraphs. I'll read that.
Cool.
Look into your own heart. You did what you were told. You went to college, graduate school, wrote and published a couple of books no one will ever read, and they give you a fancy professorship, a job for life. That's mediocrity, TeBordo. It's just the old version of mediocrity. Peter, James, and John took the leap into the information age, and they landed on couches in my basement. They didn't get what they were told, and they didn't get what they were told they'd get. That's the new mediocrity. And you and your friends, you pretended, maybe actually thought you were outside the whole thing, but you were practically the advertising campaign for it. Every time you wrote about someone who did what they were told, you depicted them as pathetic, miserable, quiet desperation or loud, alcoholism, bad sex, terrific, fat cats in the cradle. You printed the license for the world to treat them as congenitally pathetic and miserable. If there's a real John Galt, he isn't hiding out in some isolated valley. He's in New York, London, San Francisco. He's your sometimes Chicago neighbor, and you and your friends are his fucking handmaidens. He's crushing Peter and his friends to make room for condos no one will ever live in, and when he runs out of space, he'll steal the blood of your children and mainline it to make him immortal.
Damn.
So good.
That's powerful, man. I love that. I had a section picked out too. It's a little bit longer, if that's okay.
Yeah.
This is from a story in Ghost Engine called Bear Country, and the context is it's a father describing his feelings towards his child, but then he kind of gets like really into practical joking. And so that's sort of the context here. There's no feeling better than the one you get walking through your front door and stopping in the vestibule, seeing the outline of your toddler son through the frosted glass of the door to the living room, and knowing he is there waiting for you. There's nothing more powerful than the moment you inch open that frosted door and, after hanging up your coat and sliding off your shoes, peek through as your boy's eyes brighten with tears of happiness, as his mouth spreads into a goofy, gap-toothed smile, and he starts to clap his hands, to applaud, for you, for the very fact that you have arrived home at the same time you always do. There is no warmer sensation than that of lifting his little body and holding him to your chest when he raises his stubby arms to you, fingers outstretched and wriggling. there's no greater joy than to feel his hot breath on your cheek, his bird-like pulse between his temple and yours. Or so I used to think. It is so much more powerful to step through the front door and see him through the frosted glass, standing there waiting. But instead of cracking the door as soon as you've hung up your coat, to unpack the box from the costume store as carefully and quietly as possible, to slide the costume over your department store suit while your son tries to figure out what's going on the other side of the glass, to pull the massive, surprisingly realistic grizzly bear's head over your own as your son begins to back away, and realizing that the paws of your costume will make it impossible to turn the knob, and that to remove your paw, turn the knob, and replace it will ruin the effect, to crash through the frosted glass with a roar you didn't know you were capable of as your son runs screaming through the house, hitting his pale, smooth head with his tiny, impossibly soft fists and running into furniture, fixtures, walls, until he finds his mother's arms, though the screaming does not cease for a long time after. And then the next section goes on to describe other practical jokes that the father will go on to wreak havoc on his son throughout the rest of his life. And that part just like cracked me up so hard. I loved it.
Nice.
among many others, like my notes have many ha-ha-has after them in the inscriptions, particularly one from Who's Bridesmaid, and this is for any kid who grew up knowing about like Christian metal bands. Quote, even Stryper once publicly accused Bridesmaids of being kind of gay. That just cracked me up so much. I'd imagine there are quite a few autobiographical elements in Who's Bridesmaid after what you just retold us about The Cure.
You know, actually there's, there was an ambient like culture war within the church where it was like, do you only listen to Christian rock? Totally. Do you listen to non-Christian rock, or do you believe all rock music is satanic? But the rest of that is actually like entirely fabricated. I don't know if you followed the. Obviously, you can't follow a link on paper, but like if you put that link at the bottom of the page, like I actually recorded it, and it was it's definitely like an ambient part of my childhood. Like we didn't have the satanic panic or anything in my house, but like we saw those movies about how rock and roll was satanic and stuff. It was how
they sold their souls from rock and roll. Yeah.
Backward masking. You're like, we got to try that.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. I got a 4-track. The first thing I did was do back masking.
Got to try that. You summon Satan first thing.
This was the link artisticallydeclinedpress.bandcamp.com. Is that the one you're referring to, Christian? Yeah. It took me to Ryan W. Bradley's Mile Zero poems. Is that where it takes you? Oh man,
they must have changed since, because I checked it just before we published it. Much has changed.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, it was like that Artistically Declined was the publisher of the journal that initially published the story. I'll have to put that back up there somewhere.
I may have mistyped a letter or something. Hopefully.
Yeah, is it not Ryan Bradley? I'm sorry.
Ryan Bradley was he's a great fiction writer, but he ran a journal called Sententia with his press called Artistically Declined years ago, and that's where I published the story initially.
Cool.
The song is there though. The Angel Behind the Rainbow. It's there.
Good.
Like you scroll down, Dave, and it's on the right. It's there.
Oh, okay. Oh, nice.
And it says by Christian TeBordo. It's pretty cool.
That's awesome.
A companion piece to Who's Bridesmaid from Sententia. 2010. It's actually amazing that link still does work because it's like almost 10 years old, right?
Yeah.
This has been really great. I feel like we have a lot in common. I actually have a lot to say about like the way that music was presented in Christian churches in the deep piney woods of East Texas.
Oh my gosh, you can't even imagine.
Evangelical churches you could imagine. And like one time we did have like a guest preacher, this old man, like come in, and his whole sermon was about the evils of rock and roll. And awesome. Afterwards we're like, should we go just like debate this guy afterwards? And like, and I totally did, and it ended horribly. Like, you're not gonna, what am I gonna, I'm really? Some teenager, I'm gonna debate this guy? Like, are you joking me? Like, for one, it's like, you don't even talk to him. but
you're trying to extol the virtues of like Nirvana to him or something.
Just whatever you're gonna say is a fail. Like, but the whole yes, like Stryper reference and like Christian rock band, very close to my heart. So I felt, I could ID with a lot of stuff in the book.
I could
ID with it. But overall, it's very like pleasurable reading. It did remind me of like reading some, stuff from Wallace back in the old days. Like, when I felt like he was doing stuff that was cutting edge for a while, especially with pop culture, and sort of other personalities, and other writers have done this too. So like, it's not like I'm trying to just relate you to one guy. I think your shit is really original. It's really good. And I really,
absolutely,
mainly just like what we were talking earlier about, like Watt and Frag and like these painters in pursuit of pleasure. Like, I sort of saw myself as a reader of just like, why am I reading this? Like, I'm in pursuit of like aesthetic pleasure in some way, and like you definitely provided it.
Yeah, big time.
So I guess this is the point. That. I will ask you if you have any final thoughts for us, if there's anything that you wanted to mention that we have not gotten to.
Yeah.
No, I really, just so you know, if we ever talk again, I love talking about other writers. I understand where your plan comes from, but talking about other writers is way more fun for me.
Sure.
Than talking about yourself.
Sure. And I mean, I think it's a sign of a reader, right? Like, if you're a reader, that's what you read other stuff and you want to talk about it. And that's kind of like where our Wallace stuff comes from, is like when a common thing when people first read Infinite Jest is like, man, I got to talk to somebody about this. So I agree with that instinct, but I'm just trying to give advice to anyone who might listen to this. Like, don't follow I'm a professional. Totally. Don't try this at home.
I've done like email interviews for years and stuff like that. Yeah. But before I got my academic job, I had never done like a public Q&A. And like in fact, me and this Chicago writer, Lindsay Hunter, who's just she's a great writer and an incredible performer, and we did like this Northeastern tour, and like we could be in and out of a place in 20 minutes. You know what I mean? It was like, we would do our reading, we would always, we'd hang out with people and go to a bar or something like that, but we never did Q&As. And like one of the write-ups like in Boston was like, they didn't even stick around for a Q&A. And I was like, by the time I finally did my first Q&A, I was already a professor. And like, I went on for about 45 minutes and I was like, am I boring you like I'm boring myself?
That's amazing. What Matt said about the aesthetic pleasure of reading your work also makes me think of your books as beautiful objects and the art on the covers. I think Toughlahoma maybe has my favorite like cover illustration of any book I can think of. The Convalescent by Jessica Anthony is very up there as well.
Yeah, that was a good one.
Yeah,
I've been incredibly lucky with designers. You know what I mean? It was with Ghost Engine, when the editors emailed me, I was like, I have no visual sensibility. Please don't put a Ghost Engine on the cover. And then they sent me, this was the only thing they sent me as an option, and I was like, perfect. Yeah. And then with Toughlahoma, they have a really talented designer named C.V. Perez there, and he emailed me being like, I'm always willing to listen. And all I did was I sent him, the Hobbes's Leviathan.
Oh yeah,
the work of political philosophy. There's this amazing frontispiece of the.
Oh, I know it. Yeah, I know it.
Yeah. So it's just a woodcut, and it's just this amazing little work of art. And I was like, I know you're not going to recreate this, but this is what I was thinking of visually the whole time I wrote the book. And he came up with the cover, which to me is an incredible interpretation of that woodcut. So.
This reminds me. That's my Knausgaard question. This is where it comes from. Is the heart right? The heart on the front of it, and I was like, this is the Ghost Engine. And I asked you, I was like, is it creating life? Is it generating afterlife? Is it generating souls? And it reminds me of a line from Knausgaard that I really stuck with me, where he's just in very stark terms describing human life. And I think the first sentence he wrote, and maybe it's in one of those like spring, summer, fall books, but it's like, the job of the heart is to start beating, and one day it will stop. or something like that. Like the heart's job is like a heart as a thing. It just like beats and beats and beats, and then one day it stops, and that's it. And like I felt like, that bringing back to life, like the symbolism of the heart and in the engine, all of that. That's what it made me think of, and I did really like. I'm glad that that's on the cover, actually.
Nice.
Yeah, it's good. It's a good visual representation.
Dave, how are we doing on time? You ever see the old Letterman shows? He's always like, Paul, how are we doing on time? It's always right on time. We're
about an hour and a half
over. I told you it'd go by quick, though, Christian. I promise. Hopefully, it's not been total torture for you.
It's been great, man.
Awesome. Christian, if people want to get in touch with you or find more places to check out your work, what are some good places for them to do that? And we'll link all these in the show notes.
Well, there's the usual. If you're going for books, I really like this new place, bookshop.org. But my most recent stuff that's widely available and immediately available is the first story from Ghost Engine, The Star Thrower is available on the website of Always Crashing, which is a literary journal that's both print and online that I absolutely vouch for. It's just an awesome journal.
Excellent.
And then I had the How We Live on Main Street was on Volume 1 Brooklyn.
I saw that, yeah. That's
I think those are the most recent. I've been working on the forthcoming novel and then finishing up another novel, so that's what I haven't been publishing little things lately.
Cool. Right on. And you're on Twitter. You have a bit of a Twitter presence where you talk about Trump sometimes and his bathroom views. I was going to ask you about that.
What's that?
You made a tweet recently about, I think, Trump and his view on bathrooms, and you kind of agree with that. And I was like going to ask you, what is his view on bathrooms? I don't know.
Well, he was complaining about toilets, right? And the thing is that I don't know how universal this is, but like there are like flush volume rules in Chicago.
Okay.
To where like we have to like put extra water in the tank just to functionally use the toilet. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So I'm choosing to believe that he was actually advocating for me in that moment because it'd be the only time he's ever done it,
Right. Yeah, totally. That's a good way to put it. Awesome. Well, we'll link to all that stuff on the show notes. Matt, where can people find us online if they want to get in touch?
We are definitely on Twitter at Concavity Show, and we are on Instagram at Concavity Show. And I think, you can email us, concavityshow@gmail.com. We do like it when people email us, so please do email us.
We do.
And I think that's it. I think we're on Facebook, but I don't ever update that. So
yeah, we're on Facebook. Yeah. Speaking of people emailing us, shout out to a listener and patron, Robbie Sykes, who's from the area that I'm in New Zealand right now. He lives a couple hours away. And he messaged last month saying that after like the COVID lockdown, he was going to come to Dunedin to visit some friends. And do you want to hang out and get a beer or something? So we met this week on Thursday and went out for a couple drinks and talked about Wallace and books and life and everything for like 2 or 3 hours. And it was fantastic. So huge shout out to him. That was super fun. I love getting to like actually meet people who listen to the show. It's like a very surreal, disembodied experience.
Yeah, it's cool.
Yeah.
And
totally.
Dave, do we have any give a shout out to our Patreons?
Yeah, always a shout out to our patrons. No specifically new ones in the last month, but I do want to say, and Matt and I talked about this, is that we decided to donate this last month's Patreon money to the Bail Project specifically, and the reason that this came up specifically is another nerdy community that I'm a part of, and this goes back to that thing you said earlier, Christian, is that I play this game called Netrunner, which is a dystopian card game about computer hacking. And there was recently a Black Lives Matter tournament online for it in the community, and people who played in it would donate money, and the organization who was running it, which is like sort of the fan organization, they were matching all contributions, so like doubling, and they've raised almost £8,000 for the Bail Project. So we donated on behalf of the Patreon money of the last month to that. So huge shout out to everyone involved, and thank you so much for your continued support. and we just wanted to kick back to some really important things that are happening, obviously, right now in the U.S. and globally. As usual, too, we always want to thank Robin O'Neill for her art and Parquet Courts for their song Instant Disassembly. And Christian, thank you so much again for coming on. It has been a blast talking to you. We really hope that people are going to pick up Ghost Engine, Toughlahoma, and your other work and read it with as much joy as we did.
I appreciate it. I had a great time.
Catch me now as I sing. Into darkness, I thought to be extinct.
I'm Matt, and that's the guy with the actual hair on his head is Dave. Dave, can you fucking hear us? What's going on? Open up your ears, Dave. The fuck? He's out of his gourd.